to the failed arrest of Kumanjayi. The first footage I want to ask you to look at is video 2. It's footage from the body-worn video of Officer Ebel, and it relates to a conversation he had with community member Elizabeth Snape shortly before Kumanjayi's arrest. Before Kumanjayi's arrest.
Hello? Whose house is this?
Before Kumanjayi's arrest.
Hello? Who's...
Before
You're right.
Kumanjayi's arrest.
We're looking for someone. Hello? Why we have a gun?
No, why he's got a gun.
Ah. Yeah. We all carry guns.
Yeah, no, but it's like got an aim.
We're looking. No, he's not aiming to shoot anyone, is he? Hello? Why we have a gun?
No,
Who's...
why he's got a gun.
Ah. We don't have a holster for that one, so we all carry it.
Yeah, no, but it's like got an aim.
We're looking. No, he's not aiming. Someone probably shouldn't run at police with an axe. Hello? Why we have a gun?
No, why he's got a gun.
Ah. We don't have a holster for that one, so we all
That's a
carry it.
looping, just pause it there.
We're looking. No, he's not aiming. Someone probably shouldn't run at police with an axe. Hello? Why we have a gun? We don't have a holster for that one, so we all
That's a
carry it.
looping. Ms. Chilvers, if I can ask you to assume, it's difficult to hear that because the video is looping, but there is an officer with a long arm in the community, what's known as an AR-15, and you see there a young woman with a baby. There's a toddler also in the area who's crying, and the lady, Miss Snape, is questioning one of the officers as to why they have that gun. He says we don't have a holster for that. And she says, it looks like you're going to shoot somebody. He says words to the effect of somebody probably shouldn't run at police with an axe. Do you have a comment on that from a therapeutic perspective?
Poor. That is, and like, just you could see in her body language, you could see that, I could sense the distress in the children. And so they would have been picking up on the distress of the adults, and you could see in her body language she's like moving away from, even though she was communicating with him, but you could sense in that there was fear, and I think it was a totally inappropriate comment to make.
Can and to be fair on the police officer, he's acknowledged that and has apologised for it.
Yeah.
Can an interaction like that with a police officer for a child have a long-term impact on their trust of police?
Oh, yes.
And if a child has experienced trauma in their life, along in the sort of trauma that you set out in relation to Kumanjayi, where they have had exposure to family violence from an early age, for example, or experienced the death of a parent or being disconnected from family members, can an incident like that further traumatise?
Yes, the impacts of trauma is cumulative, so it's the more trauma, the greater the impact. And that was those children will be traumatised.
And if children who have cumulative complex trauma don't receive the correct and sufficient interventions, you would envisage that will play out in their behaviour in the future.
Yes, 100%.
And it will play out in negative, not positive behaviours.
Yes.
Which may lead to increased engagements with police.
The evidence supports that completely.
Does the evidence support, in terms of what sort of attitudes people develop or behaviour people develop towards others in authority, does it lead to experiences of fear of people in authority
Yes.
and hostility towards people in authority?
Yes.
I just want to show you this second video.
But it's deeper than that, isn't it? It's that inability to regulate your neurophysiology.
Yeah.
So you are very reactive
Yes.
in ways that outsiders don't understand.
Yes.
And it appears to be kind of, to an outsider, it might appear to be deliberate or poor behaviour,
Yes.
naughtiness,
Yes.
when in fact it is behaviour derived from that developmental interruption of
Yes.
those systems in your body.
Yes. And I mean, if you think about if you're driving along and, you know, it happened to me the other day, I was driving along, I could hear the sirens of an ambulance and, you know, you can't see where the ambulance is. So you're looking around and you don't know what to do. So I'm driving up onto the roundabout because I didn't know where to go and my heart was racing. So, you know, that's just my response in that situation. Yeah.
A person who has not had a significant, I'm not saying you haven't
Yeah.
had any, because we already know that you've had trauma experiences that you've told us about,
Yeah.
but a person who hasn't had that very
That deep developmental trauma.
Continued.
Chronic.
early
Yeah.
trauma,
Yeah.
and the trauma that you have experienced has also been in the context of a from what you've told
Yeah.
me, like I only know
Yeah.
what you've told me,
Yeah.
but from a well functioning family unit with very strong attachment in relation to.
I wouldn't go as far as
Okay.
saying that, but yes, certainly
Alright,
not the same
I was
level of
just-
trauma.
right.
Yeah.
I
And I've
appreciate
also
there's
done a lot of
definitely
trauma
been-
recovery.
Okay, I definitely am aware of the trauma that you've told us
Yes.
about.
Thank you.
But I'm not aware of anything further than that. But for children who don't have those very kind of safe, permanent attachment relationships, the problem,
Yeah.
there's limited opportunity for healing.
Yes. Yes.
So just before I show you the next video, I just want to remind those listening what you've explained to be the known adverse childhood experiences that Kumanjayi had. And this is set out in table 2. I don't need to take you to it. Prenatal exposure to substances, premature birth, failure to thrive, pneumonia, and other health and social issues as an infant. He experienced neglect. Exposure to substance misuse from an early age and through his childhood. There was abuse. There was exposure to family violence from an early age and through his childhood and abuse. There was removal from the care of his mum as an infant. So there was an attachment problem and disconnection. Death of both parents as a child, tragically. And he was raised in kinship care and disconnected from his maternal family,
Yes.
despite the best intentions.
Yes.
And in terms of the impact on him, you note that's that had a negative impact on neurodevelopment.
Yes.
That meant that he experienced that vagal shutdown, or freeze. He had difficulty with affect regulation,
Yes.
hypervigilance, hyperactivity. He was impulsive,
Yes.
and he had an automatic flight or escape response to threat. And if he couldn't escape, then he would resort to fight when he was in that circumstance of fear.
Yeah.
And then after that might come the dorsal overwhelm where you just completely
Yes.
shut down. Can I then show you the video of the lead up and attempted arrest of Kumanjayi? That's video 1 for Jess. Overwhelm where you just completely
Yes.
shut down. Can I then show you the video
there, we'll
of
have
the
to
lead
fix
up?
that
Technical issue, Jess.
Do you need me to go off the bench, Jess? There is.
Yeah. We'll just perhaps ring Patrick and say.
I'll adjourn briefly while that's
Thank you.
We've got that sense temporarily.
Jess, do you have Beck's telephone number? Because this has happened before and she has somehow fixed it.
Sorry, Karen.
That's okay.
Don't feel stressed, Jess. We'll get there.
Oh, you're leaving?
Yeah.
You'll actually get caught up in what happened. I mean, that's what communication is. I'm not there.
Oh, you're leaving?
You'll actually get caught up in what happened. I mean, that's what communication is. I'm not there. So you just have to go out at lunch, and Philly has a court case in Melbourne, so it might be a little window where we're not. Well, just but be nice. Don't be like it's tough. Just take on my chum.
He'll make it in time.
If he doesn't walk in the door, you go.
Yeah. Your Honour, I've decided I'm going to sit down
You want
until
to
the
charge
other. Yeah, let's get that.
and just put it there.
We can just,
Such fascinating stuff.
well, just
I was just saying to someone else outside, a number of my clients who did what you're saying.
Yes.
Doesn't really
we may not, neither of us may get
make it into the ordinary run-of-the-mill psychological analysis that does come with a lot of criminal cases.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Hi, now you put the idea in my head.
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing in Aboriginal communities.
If you don't see it, you should ask me.
Is the live stream still on?
It's on now.
When did it?
Hey, little one.
We need me to call when we adjourn, and then it just
That's all right, I'll do it too quickly.
Just 5 seconds. Just before we finish.
Hey, missus.
Can't believe it's on set. I was listening. I'm Switzerland.
Hey, little one.
Not after
Hey,
this.
missus.
Yesterday we both showed them. That was Daniel Corey. Oh, is that right? It says it was Daniel. Are you serious?
Hey, little one.
Oh my god. Show me true colours, mate.
Hey, little one.
Oh,
USB to Simon.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, great. How are we going, Jess? Oh, good on you, Doug. Great. I'm sorry to carry on, but
That's okay.
we'll get there and
Yeah, that's just made me panic about how many more? Oh my god. Terrible. Yeah, Daniel's on to it. But yeah, it just makes me think well, I haven't seen it.
that's not original.
Yeah.
So I just have to, excuse me. And we can just press on but if you've got a longer period of time, we'll go for sure.
The Coronial Inquest of Kumanjayi Walker will commence shortly.
Oh, really? You go see each other again. That's the jail, so it's church life, really. That's why things are going well.
Coronial closed out.
I think we've got those technological issues sorted out, Your Honour. Great.
Hey, little one. Hey, missus. Hey, missus, where's Arnold at? Are you seeing Rakisha today? Oh no. Whose house is this?
Margaret's, but they're still in
Can we go check inside? Because we're looking. Go check inside? Alright.
So you don't know who else is in the house?
Me and Adam are just going to clear this red house. Hey. What's your name, mate? Hey, mate, what's your name? Sorry. Stop, mate. We're just asking you a question. No need to keep walking.
Vernon.
Vernon who?
Dixon.
Dixon.
Yeah.
Just come over here for a sec. Up here.
Now, my name is Vernon Dixon.
Is it?
Yeah. And she's my auntie.
Alright, don't stress. Be calm. I'm going to put a photo next to your face and see who you are.
Yeah.
That's all, okay?
Yeah, I'm Vernon Dixon.
Yeah, just chill out. Don't stress. Compare a photo, okay? That's all. Relax. I need this hat off. Hey, Vernon. Just relax.
I'm just telling you that.
Relax. Yes, I understand. Just leave your hat off. Don't put it on. Yeah, it'll be around the front of the greenhouse. Just inside the front door, mate. Stand by. Look straight ahead. Just inside the front door. That's not you?
Yep. My name is Vernon Dixon.
Oh, good man. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Easy, mate. Easy. Just put your hands behind your back. Stop it, mate.
And then, Miss Chilvers, tragically, we know what happens next. That Kumanjayi took a pair of scissors from his pocket, and Constable Rolfe's evidence is that he was then stabbed in the shoulder, and we see the wound mark that he suffered, and then Kumanjayi was shot. What are your reflections on the approach to Kumanjayi in those circumstances?
I'll just reflect on my physiological response to watching that, and it was when he's pushing him and takes his hat off, and that there are other ways to do that.
What would, knowing Kumanjayi, what would have been going on for him first? So one of the officers removes Kumanjayi's hat. Constable Rolfe uses his hand to press against Kumanjayi's chest and says the words "relax." Stay there. First, to be fair on Constable Rolfe, he doesn't know the background of Kumanjayi. Are the words "relax" of any comfort to Kumanjayi in those circumstances? Why not?
Because when people's arousal systems are heightened, their cognitive brain goes offline. They can't hear those words. And he's saying them in the tone. It's relax, come on, relax. Does that sound relaxing to you?
So I'll ask you first, what would have been going on in Kumanjayi's mind to the best?
He would have been going, I want to get out of here. How can I get out of here? And you can see him moving towards the exit. Yeah.
Is he likely to have perceived the officers as a threat?
Yes.
A physical threat?
Yes.
And then you have drawn that picture that he did for you while he was in custody of his hands and something going on in his hands.
Yeah.
What did that... Is that likely to have been still a factor that was operating on him at this time? Something going on in his hands?
He may or may not have been consciously aware of anything that was going on inside of him, but I can see from his movements he's looking to escape. He wants to get out of there.
And his ability to escape is blocked
Yes.
at the time when Constable Rolfe says, put your hands behind your back.
Yeah.
And it's clear to him he's going to be detained and he can't get out.
Yeah.
So what's going on for him at that time?
The only response left for him was fight.
And is that a conscious response?
No.
Again, drawing on your expertise about an understanding of trauma, what happens in the body in terms of the unconscious response?
It moves into survival. Like the thinking brain is gone offline, so he would never have had the intention to stab Constable Rolfe. It's just he wasn't able to get away, and so he would have gone into that survival mode. My next option is fight, and that wouldn't have been a thought. He wouldn't have thought that. He would have just, this is it, it's like, and he would just respond, just react, not respond.
So it sounds the way that you describe it as your physical body hijacks your brain. In
Yes.
those circumstances.
That's
Do you think that Kumanjayi would have had any perception of the fact that he was in danger if he acted out physically?
no. I mean, he already would, like, I imagine that in between, he knows that he's in danger when being arrested beforehand, but all of that goes offline when he's being arrested.
Do you think that, is it your opinion that for Kumanjayi with his traumas, he's capable of computing in that moment, I can't lash out here and injure a police officer because then I might get shot?
He did not have the capacity to have that level of reasoning at that point in time.
So, drawing on your knowledge, if you were instructing police who were going in to detain him at that time, what is the appropriate way to do that to minimise risk to them and to Kumanjayi?
As I said before, that would have, like, I think there was a plan that was already developed. I think that Derek Williams should have been involved, that it should have been organised with family, and that he should have been allowed to give himself up. And that way he would, you know, he's prepared for that, and he would have.
We understand that in terms of the plan for the that there was a plan for a 5 a.m. arrest that would have involved Felix Alfeo, who wasn't family but was somebody who Kumanjayi knew and had been happy to come with in the past. I appreciate that's not ideal from your perspective, but is that still better than going to the house with no officer who's had any?
Yeah, I mean, the timing was really also awful too. You know, the funeral had been going on in that day. It just, yeah.
Miss Chilvers, while we are on the videos, I'm going to show you a third video and ask for your opinion, your expert opinion, as a psychologist in terms of the potential impact on this child. This is a different child. I won't name him, but it's a young person who was then aged 14, and it's an incident where Constable Rolfe was looking for this young person who was hiding in a bin. So this is video 3 that Jess will show you. And could you go to the 11 minutes, 25 seconds time frame? That's fine.
Got him.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. I'm sorry. Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. Sorry. Sorry, sir.
Yeah, Tony Gibson in custody down the bottom corner near Charles Creek.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. Sorry for running, sir.
Cuffs on. Hey, you head towards you.
Sorry, sir.
Tony, you're under arrest. Breaching bail.
Sorry, sir. Don't need to feel wrong.
You don't need to speak to me. Anything you say may be used as evidence.
Probably enough there. I asked you to assume that that young person was in the care of the minister and that he also experienced trauma. On that day, he'd run from court and he was being detained and being brought back. What do you have any opinion to offer in terms of whether or not that would be a trauma for that child to be arrested in that manner?
That would be very traumatic, yeah, for anybody to be arrested in that manner. particularly the throwing the bin down on the ground like that, because that would have come as a shock to their system. They might not have been expecting that. They knew they were in the bin, so that's one part of it, but the slamming the bin down on the ground, that would have not been expected.
They knew they were in the bin. I'm not sure if you noticed it from viewing it on that one occasion, but when Constable Rolfe first approaches the young person, makes a clicking noise, he then puts the bin lid down.
Yeah.
Is that appropriate from your therapeutic perspective?
I wouldn't want to be in the position that he was in you know, what is the right way to go around arresting somebody according to the circumstances that are around. But I think that demonstrates a lot about his attitude, like, we gotcha, like that.
In terms of whether or not there is a long-term impact on a child who's already experienced trauma of being arrested in that manner, are you able to offer an opinion?
It was very disrespectful. It would be a further addition to that young person's cumulative trauma, and it would also not create. It's about that creating trust with social agencies. It's not going to support that young person's ability to have good relationships or respect for police.
To be fair on Constable Rolfe, there's no evidence that he had any trauma-informed training offered by Northern Territory Police, but you will have heard the young person say, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry for running, sir. No need to be rough." And we hear Constable Rolfe say, "You don't need to talk to me, but anything you say can be used against you." Is there any
How old was that kid? 14? 14.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had an intellectual disability and a history of trauma.
Right.
If you were training police as to the appropriate way to respond, putting aside the physicality, what are there words that should be spoken in those circumstances?
You would listen, and you would speak in a calm and soft. It's the tone of the voice and the pace of the voice in the communicating that helps the nervous system to regulate. So you would speak in a soft and calm voice.
And would you, if you were training on how police officers should deal with that, even if you need to physically detain somebody, would you train them that you can use words of reassurance, like, "It's all right, mate. You don't need to panic. You're not in any physical danger. We just need to," and explain what you're actually doing?
Yes, if you were to explain each step of the way and listen, like he was using his social engagement system that was a safety mechanism on his behalf too. He was going, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to run. So he had submitted, and that's partially that dorsal vagal shutdown. So that child had implemented his safety system to do that, to plead, I'm sorry, so he wouldn't get hurt.
And you would expect a response to that?
Yes. So that would have been really appropriate, would be, "Yeah, I know, mate. I know. I'm sorry. This is how it is, and, let's go."
And in terms of asking for that young person to grow up into an adult who respects authority, are those interactions an opportunity to have either a positive or a negative impact on a young person?
Yes.
And that interaction?
Was a negative.
Given that we have evidence of those interactions, do you think that underscores the importance for Northern Territory police officers to be trained in the longer term impact?
Yes.
And what they can do to contribute to social cohesion?
Yes.
Are you able to provide any insight in relation to the percentage of children who come into engagements with the police, how many of those children are likely to have trauma or cognitive impairments?
There is some research into that. It may be included amongst my materials. There is, it's very high, like really high. It's almost inevitable if that process isn't interrupted in many ways, or that child doesn't get trauma recovery. It's almost inevitable.
So the starting point for any interactions by police with children is a presumption of trauma or cognitive impairment on the part of the child.
That is correct. That is, in trauma-informed practice, like in the alcohol and drug services, 90% of all clients entering an alcohol and drug service report at least one trauma, but about 2/3 report multiple traumas. So we assume, in trauma-informed practice, we assume that everybody has experienced trauma and we treat them accordingly.
So all training in relation to engagements with children by police should commence with the presumption that there is a trauma or cognitive background in issue and in play.
Yes.
Ms. Chilvers, you, as I asked you earlier, continued to engage with Kumanjayi for various reasons, as you set out in your statement, in your various roles, right up until the time when he was 19 and shortly before he passed. Can you tell Her Honour about the last time that you saw Kumanjayi?
The last time I saw Kumanjayi was on the 1st of November, and Leanne rang me. She was very distressed. She said, Kumanjayi's run away from Kapu. Can you come and help me? He wants to go back to Kapu. And so I was working at the youth detention centre at that time. I was on my way to work, but I went around to Jimmy's Furnitures over near Elder Street there, and Kumanjayi was there with with Leanne and with Leanne's partner. And Kumanjayi just sort of like leaned against my car, and I spoke with Leanne, and Leanne said, he'd run away, he wants to go back. And so I rang Kapu, and I said, I'm here with Kumanjayi and Leanne, and he wants to come back to Kapu. Can he come back to Kapu? And Adrian answered, and he said that they would have to hold a meeting to determine whether or not they would have him come back. And I had to get to work, so I gave him Leanne's number, and I said, after that meeting, can you please ring Leanne and let her know what that outcome is?
And did you speak to Kumanjayi on that day?
Yes, as I was leaving, I said, "Oi, give me a look at you." And he turned around and he looked at me and he smiled at me. And I said to him, it's so good to see your face.
And did he seem to be quite calm that day?
Yes.
And then I'm not going to take you through this in any detail, but in relation to the night that he passed away, you received a phone call on the 9th of November from one of his grandmas, Kelly.
Yes.
And she was very distressed, and she told you that her grandson had been shot.
Yeah.
And you then obviously were tuning into Facebook and trying to find out anything you could about what happened. You were based in Alice Springs, is that right?
Yeah.
You set out in your statement a number of people who you spoke to. You rang Leanne, who was clearly distraught.
Yeah.
And you went up to Alice Springs Hospital to try and
Yes.
find out what had gone on.
Yes.
What time did you arrive at the hospital?
I think it was about 1:30 in the morning. But, when you're in the midst of that, it's really hard to remember the exact times. You're not looking at your watch. But it was early in the morning.
Did you speak to any clinic staff?
I went to the emergency department and I spoke to whoever was behind the counter. I did not get any names, and I just asked about Kumanjayi, and they told me he wasn't a patient.
And then sometime the next morning you found out that tragically he passed.
Well, after that I went straight to the police station.
I see. And
yeah.
Did you speak to anybody there?
I spoke to somebody there and I asked the same question, where is he? And they went out for a long time and came back out and said, we are not able to give you any information, and I had to go home.
And you actually found out from Terry Waller the next day that
Yes.
Kumanjayi had passed. You go on to talk about the aftermath of Kumanjayi's death and the impact that it's had on family, community, yourself. For young people in Yuendamu, what is the likely impact for them in terms of their relationship with agencies like the police?
You know, kids, they will say, you know, you'll get shot now. It's like, it's had a significant impact. And because there hasn't been, you know, there's been as much, well, there probably, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what is needed, but it's if these are already traumatized kids, that's not going to help develop their relationships with police.
And we have heard from a number of community-based police who care deeply about building relationships. But is it the case that it takes a while to rebuild trust in a community after an incident like this?
I think it's going to take years.
Ms. Chilvers, after Kumanjayi passed away, you came to work back in Yuendamu for a period, and you set that out in your statement. You explained that from, let's get the time frame, from November 2020 through to May 2021, you took 6 months leave to return to Waidak as the Clinical Governance and Program Development Officer. Your main responsibilities were to provide clinical expertise, community experience and community development skills to redevelop Waidak's youth diversion program. What motivated you to go back a year after Kumanjayi had passed?
To help facilitate the change that was needed within the organisation so that like they would be more trauma informed and family inclusive, as well as culturally based.
In the year after Kumanjayi passed, had you visited Yuendamu?
Only for his funeral.
Okay. Did you form a view as to how Waidak was going in that year?
Well, I'd had from January 2018 to July or June in 2019, I was working as a community psychologist with Department of Health, and I was my main community was Yuendamu. So always, whatever I had an opportunity to connect with Yuendamu, I would always take that opportunity. So, like my view of Waidak is that after Susie and Brett left, it had a really solid structure back then, and staff were well supported, and then that seemed to fade away.
You name these people in your statement. So that's Susie Lowe, who was the former CEO, and Brett Badger, who was the former operations manager.
Yes.
There was a period of time when they were there at Waidak working alongside Yapa, and it was functioning well.
Yeah.
And then they left the organisation. Do you know when they left?
It was either 2006. I think Susie left before Brett. I'm not sure. I can't remember, but it was around 2016.
And then after that, there was a deterioration in service provision, is what you say in your statement.
Yeah.
You also say that the provision of purchase orders, which are vouchers to be used for food, drinks, petrol, etc., to clients, rather than therapeutic services, appears to have become commonplace within the organisation.
During that period.
That period. What do you say about that? What impact does that have?
Well, I will give an example of a young person that I witnessed digitally sodomise his younger brother, and I sought the support of Waidak for family therapy. They had a family therapist in their intensive family support service. That incident went to a mandatory report, of course. It was investigated and found unsubstantiated, and it's like, how can you say it's unsubstantiated when I witnessed it with my own eyes? And so I followed up with Waidak and asked them what they were doing for the family, because those boys, you know, that's significant trauma. And, you know, where did that one learn that to do that to another young one? And they were very non-communicative with myself at that particular point in time. And I asked the family what support was being offered, and they said they're not getting any support except purchase orders.
When you returned, in terms of the purchase orders, if people are hungry or they don't have petrol, one might empathise with an organisation trying to help out there.
Yeah.
But your belief is that that creates a negative, it has a negative impact?
It creates dependency. It does. It creates dependency. Whereas the SavGen model is a model of social enterprise that creates enterprise and entrepreneurship and sustainability, and the social capital that exists in Yuendamu, like, is enormously valuable.
Going back to when you were a kid at 11, and you said, I think you made a comment that when you returned there in 1992, there was rubbish everywhere in the community.
Yeah.
Do you remember that as a child, or was that
No,
not the
it wasn't
case?
like that. No, it was. You could walk around barefoot. I used to walk around barefoot, and I used to, like, they were teaching me how to identify people's footprints, like tracking people. So, you know, I knew I could look at the ground and look at people's footprints and know who'd walked that way.
Do you remember as a child going into other people's houses, into yuppa houses?
They were more like donkey houses back then, and yes.
What do you mean by?
Donkey houses are like little Besser block brick with a round roof like that. They were sort of around the outer edges and in the community. They call them donkey houses.
Did you have a perception of them being places that you like to go into?
I spend a lot of time, with my friends in their house, and they spend a lot of time in my house.
We've heard about the levels of overcrowding in houses now,
Yes.
and in fact you refer to some of those social problems. Was that a perception you had as a child, or has it got worse over time?
I think it's gotten worse, and I think it gets worse when the mobility of families, and so in the house there at this, one house might only have a certain number of people, and then family from Nirrupi might come over, and then there's only one toilet in that house, and there's 23 people. And some of those houses, there's up to 18 to 20 people with one toilet and one bathroom.
And that wasn't the case when you were a child, that you can remember?
Overcrowding wasn't a thought in my head when I was a kid. It was just like fun.
But you didn't have a perception of it being a place that was that you didn't want to go into?
No, I loved going in there. I loved sitting down and drinking billy tea and damper, with the families.
One of the things you mentioned to me outside the courtroom is that when you were a kid, there was no such thing as iPhones, there was no television, is that right?
No television, there wasn't even telephone.
But there was a sense of real community and social cohesion.
There was.
When you came back to Waidak, you make a number of observations of your experience. You tried to have that issue of vouchers dealt with.
Yeah.
Were you successful?
No.
For new people coming in who have a problem with the voucher system and can see, you said that voucher systems create an issue of dependency.
Yeah.
Is that the only problem with them?
It's also the power differential. These people, a lot of people build their relationships on the basis of being able to give a purchase order rather than actually developing real relationships, and that's not a real relationship. That creates a power structure that's unhealthy.
For a staff member who then comes in and wants to break that cycle and has your level of understanding about that, are there difficulties?
Yes, there are.
Because you're suddenly saying, no, I'm not going to give you that. You returned to Waidak, as I said, over that sort of 6-month period, a year after Kumanjayi's passing. Was there any therapeutic intervention available for family or community experiencing the level of trauma that they had done from Kumanjayi's passing?
No.
one thing that you told me about was
Oh, hang on, sorry. Can you repeat that question?
Sure. During that 6-month period, was
Oh.
there any therapy offered or counselling services, anything for trauma?
No. I know that they brought, when the trial was on, they had Ghana Healing coming, and that was very supportive.
I see. So I'll ask you about that. The trial was the trial was earlier this year in February.
Yeah.
And you referred to Ghana Healing. We understand that Ghana Healing is based around in Bunjalung country.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to do with Ghana Healing coming? Ghana?
I was speaking with Chris Tudor, who was the manager of the Children and Family Services program, and we talked about it, and she organised it. Yeah.
And have you spoken to family and community members who participated in that healing?
I think it was very positive. I've spoken to Ghana Healing about it.
Okay. Is that an interview? I want to come now to some recommendations.
Yeah.
To end on what is a hopeful note, or at least something, a strengths-based note. You have a number of suggestions for what might be developed to help Yapa people in Yundamu and to empower them. When you were at WIDAC for that 6-month period back in 2020 to May 2021, do you recall how many board members there were?
Well, there was something like 50. Yeah.
And do you know the rationale for having so many board members for a not-for-profit?
I think it was to be inclusive of all of the different clan groups.
You have a lot of respect for many of the board members, is
Yes.
that right? You were mentioning, for example, Warren Williams. You have an enormous amount of respect for the work that he does in community.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not asking you to name any names or to suggest any criticism, but what do you think is the best way to make sure that everybody in the community can have a say and get a service from WIDAC?
I think that Stephen Walter Patrick is the best person to speak on that. So I can only share with you what he shared with me as his recommendation, and that is to go back to cultural law. That is to go back to the kinship systems and make sure that it's all the kira and kurungulu. So the kira traditional owners and the kurungulu are the policeman type thing that make sure the traditional owners are doing the right thing. To go back to that system, to apply that system, and have equal representation from each of the communities. Like if WIDAC is going to service the Walbury communities, then there needs to be equal representation from those 4 different communities, and using the kinship system of accountability.
And we can ask if he's available, Stephen Walter Patrick, to assist in that regard. But it's about Yapa-led programs, is that right?
Yes.
And in terms of any services or therapies available to the community, are you able to say from your perspective as a trauma counsellor what should be available?
I think because, Walbury mob have nobody, and you wouldn't wish that experience upon anybody. So, and I do talk in my report about the impacts of colonisation. Yes. And it's I think we need to, Walbury people haven't had to deal with this kind of stuff, so they haven't. And I mean, I've only just learned about, not only just, but I've been studying intensely developmental trauma, which also, comes intergenerationally as well. So we've got to look all the way back, and then we have to find the solutions on the ground and from the ground up and from the brainstem up.
So it's not just helping a young person in crises, it's helping their entire family and community.
Yes.
I'm just going to ask Jess to go back to the statement of the 28th of November, and I will just put up figure 5, which is at paragraph 7.2, page 12 of the first attachment. And it's a figure where you look at colonisation and some of the impacts of colonisation, and you make the point that we need to understand those impacts.
Yes.
And empower Yapa to understand and address them.
Yes. Empower the white systems to understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Thank you, Jess. You say this describes the bigger picture story of what happened to Kumanjayi. Can you see Kumanjayi? If you look closely, you'll see him in almost every box beneath the word colonisation. So starting with colonisation, what flowed from that was the loss of hunter-gatherer lifestyle due to loss of lands and the formation of fixed settlements like Yulumu. And you go out from that marginalisation from Cardia society, white society, poor communication and discrimination, unemployment, poverty, poor education, alcohol and substance abuse, domestic violence, accidents, deaths in custody. In fact, every single one of those boxes is relevant to Kumanjayi.
Yes.
Flowing from colonisation and the loss of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you know, poor nutrition, low birth weight, diabetes, hypertension and cardiovascular disease. In fact, from the time he was born premature, Kumanjayi experienced poor nutrition and failure to thrive.
Mm.
We also know about his hearing loss, which related to education difficulties. And from colonisation, you know, fixed settlements, fringe camps, urban ghettos, poor housing, poor hygiene, overcrowding and infectious diseases, respiratory disease, ear disease, rheumatic heart disease and renal disease. Are you really saying, Ms. Chilvers, that if we are serious about addressing or about preventing death in traumatic circumstances like Kumanjayi, you really need to look at addressing those underlying impacts of
Yes.
intergenerational trauma?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honour. I might stop there and give my learned friends an opportunity.
Yes, are there any other questions for Ms. Chilvers? Yes. Yes. Speakers. Sorry.
Hi, Ms. Chilvers. My name's Julie Pincus. I am representing one of the lawyers representing the Walker, Lane and Robertson families. Is it okay if I call you Ms. Chilvers?
Yes.
Right, okay. You were clearly very fond of Kumanjayi and have developed a very close relationship with him. And he and Leanne trusted you, and you paint a very powerful picture in your statements of someone who, in a safe and structured environment, could have been was a very good son, friend, and partner. And I know you've given a lot more information about positive things about him, but what you may or may not be aware is that in the criminal trial, there was an incredible or an inordinate amount of negative stuff said about Kumanjayi. So I was just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add to sort of perhaps address that balance in terms of positive aspects. I mean, I know you've given a lot already, but is there anything else that you'd like to add?
He was a young man with a big heart. He was a caring young man.
Okay, thanks. And have you had any conversations with the families about the impact of that negative picture having been painted at the trial, the impact on them?
I talk to Leanne from time to time. I don't try to bring back any of the negativity because I don't want to talk, she's traumatised from this whole process. I talked to Terry Waller about the fun times that he had over there and the good things. Sorry, I missed your question.
No, that's fine. It was more just the impact. It's just that was.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of the extent. I know from my clients that they were very distressed about.
Yes.
The emphasis on the negative.
Yes. I haven't really spoken to them about it because that's just Leanne has had enough. That's why she's not here today.
Yes.
She can't do any more.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that because I feel it myself. I'm really glad that today has come. It's been 3 years of my life and I can't begin to imagine what it's been like for the family.
You also in your statement talk about his primary learning style being auditory.
Yeah.
And you're clearly aware of his hearing issues.
Yeah.
Are you aware whether that analysis of his learning style was passed on to the school?
I don't know.
No, okay. Okay, just in terms of the communication
Yeah.
between the different agencies.
Yeah.
Secondly, just talking about the phone call, the 1st of November in your statement that you had in the presence, that when you called Kapu in the presence of Leanne and Kumanjayi, just confirming there was definitely you who made that phone call.
Yes.
Yeah. And you gave them Leanne's number to let her know the outcome, and you say that you don't know the outcome, and you confirm that again. At
Yes.
what stage did you hear that Kapu was not willing to
I
take?
never got that outcome because
Oh,
I
I
had
see.
to go, I think I went the next day up to Darwin for work. So Leanne would mostly just contact with me when she needed my support, and it's not like we talk every day on the phone or anything like that. So I was travelling up to Darwin I was working with the Youth Detention Centre then.
Okay.
So I empowered Leanne by leaving it,
Yes.
by leaving it there. So I would have imagined that there was really no need for her. I don't know.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's more just now that you do know that, does that surprise you that they said he can't come back? I mean, clearly, given you asked the question, you were anticipating that the answer could have been yes.
Yes, I was hoping that it would have been yes.
Yes.
Yes, I never knew what happened, and because the next time I spoke to Leanne was after he'd been shot, it was no longer relevant to talk about it.
Right. Next thing is that at the time you made that phone call, you were also aware that there was a funeral coming up that he wanted to attend.
Yes.
Right. And you're clearly aware of the importance of sorry business and his attendance. So are you aware, so had he been allowed back, are you aware that in addition to the logistics and some distance issues with attending sorry business, that there are potentially people in places like Carp who might be reluctant given the cost? Do you have any information about that? The cost that may be imposed?
Well, I've done it with other young people before, and I would have reached out to WIDAC in that instance, or Kalis. Kalis would be a great support in that event. So if it had been that they accepted him back, and other young people, I've had permission for them to attend a funeral, and so I've liaised with Kalis or with WIDAC, and they can organise to pick up that young person and take them and supervise them and then to bring them back.
Okay.
So it was not a logistical issue.
But have you had any experience with an organisation like CARP who's saying, yes, that person can attend, but it's going to cost X thousand dollars or something? No, it's always left for it to be organised by someone else.
Yeah.
So it's not, I was just thinking in the sense that they might, and what I have heard is they need to be accompanied by someone. So it may not be just a case of being picked up.
Well, in that case, like they would be accompanied by, for example, a WIDAC employee.
Yeah,
so the WIDAC would then take on the responsibility of their supervision during that period.
Okay.
I have done that before.
Right, okay. And then you've given evidence about your view that, a number of times about him, Kumanjayi would have been happy to hand himself in had Derek Williams been involved. Also, in relation to the funeral, is it, do you agree that had he been also provided with assistance to sort of navigate handing himself in with the assurance that he may get bail to attend the funeral, then he definitely would have been happy? Do you have any feel for that? That is that additional assistance that was necessary for him to navigate the system?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in your letter to the magistrate in 2018, you talk about how the reason he ran away, this was from Youth Detention Centre, was that he didn't like the treatment he'd received from the guards. And you identify clearly in your statement that he thrives in a structured environment, but really struggled in youth detention, given it was overcrowded, understaffed detention environment. So is it your view that youth detention, from everything you've told us and you know about Kumanjayi, that youth detention would be the worst possible environment for Kumanjayi?
a trauma-informed youth detention centre, he would probably have been okay in if they were trained in trauma-informed practice because of the structure that it provides. But a chaotic centre with 26 kids, overcrowding in the cells, absolutely not okay.
You mentioned in your statement the incident of the dog bites after the police dog had attacked Kumanjayi when he escaped the second time from youth detention. He would have been 16 years old at that time. What is your view about the appropriateness or otherwise of using dogs to help bring in young people?
Well, we all would have known exactly where he was going. He was on his way to Walbury Camp. There's no need to implement such extreme measures. He was not a person who was intent on going and hurting anybody. He was just going home. And so, yes, he's breaking the law by escaping detention. I acknowledge that. However, that was an unnecessary response because you could just find him a couple of hours later at Walbury Camp.
But more generally, just the use of dogs. I mean, even if you didn't know where he was going to end up, just using.
I think it's extreme, and particularly for a young person.
Yeah. When you went to the Alice Springs Hospital the night of the shooting or the morning after, you said you think about 1:30 on the 10th of November, did you come across any of his relatives and have any interaction with them at the hospital?
No.
No, okay. You also talk about, in another part of your statement, there was frustrating that at no time you had access to all the information about Kumanjayi.
Yes.
I'm just keen to hear your thoughts on how you think that sort of transparency and open communication could happen between agencies more clearly, given privacy concerns and other concerns. Have you got some thoughts about that?
Well, I think when it comes to young people, it's really important that, to have all of the information. This person holding this information, the report written by Kate Crawley was written in 2017, and in 2000, I think it was 18, I'm arguing to the magistrate for a cognitive assessment to be done, but one had been done, but I didn't know about it.
Right.
Yeah.
But so how do you think? Can you think of a way that might be structured? That it's
better collaboration and integration of service delivery and holistic case plans and multidisciplinary team meetings that involve family and community as well as stakeholders.
Yeah. And so I suppose that leads to your other suggestion that just be one person who has a complete picture, but presumably that not being someone who's a corrections-based caseworker.
Yeah.
Which was sort of, I think, what was happening here, that the only person in the middle was the parole officer, potentially, who also presumably didn't have all the information.
Yeah.
So what I'm reading for your statement is that you were probably the closest person to being that one person, but that was only as a result of sort of a combination of serendipity and your incredible conscientiousness and hard work, which means that you managed to stay in contact with him over 7 years and 3 different jobs. But that was only because of your relationship.
Yes.
So again, I suppose you've sort of answered this already, but in lieu of someone like you, how do you see that? And that just comes to the collaboration. You see it working just as long as there's collaboration, but you need the appointment of one person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. A team, a small team, because, like Brooke mentioned, if you only have one person and that person goes,
yes,
and they're not like me, then that information is lost. So
Yeah, that's true. And but then the problem with the team is it might fall through the cracks.
Yeah. I mean, it is a difficult logistical thing, but there does need to, I think, there needs to be just more collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No further questions.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think I'm next, Your Honour. My name's Melanie and I'm appearing for the Brown family. I probably have about 20 minutes of questions, so I'm not sure if Your Honour would prefer to break first.
I've been asked by Mr. Hutton if it's possible to continue. I think that's the witness's preference, but I wonder if we might just check from the bar table
how many other people wish to ask questions and for what length of time?
I think Mr. Derrick has 30 minutes and Miss Mullaney has 20. Is that right?
That's right.
Else, Dr. Pepperberry?
Yes. All right. It's a long period of time when it's now 1 o'clock.
Could we possibly have
Just do it again.
Would you want to excuse me for a moment?
Yes.
The witness has asked if we could continue, Your Honour.
Are we able to continue? Is there someone else we can sit in? All right. Yes. All right.
Thank you.
Ms. Chilvers, my name's Maxine Mullaney and I appear for the Brown family, which of course includes Leanne Oldfield. By 2019, did you know the Brown family and Miss Oldfield fairly well?
Yes.
You've said in your statement that your first impression upon meeting Kumanjayi at the Mount Theo program was that the family had difficulty controlling and managing his behaviour.
Yeah.
You obviously have told us that you didn't fully understand his behaviour at that point in time. Did you later come to appreciate that the situation with Kumanjayi's behaviour and his history was much more complicated than you knew at that time?
Yes.
And you came to learn that after further education and experience.
Yes.
You've stated in your third statement that when looking at Kumanjayi's situation, one must also take into consideration the role of the collective transgenerational, intergenerational and historical trauma.
Yes.
And that Kumanjayi's family are themselves victims and not to be blamed for what happened to him.
Yes.
You stand by that?
Yes.
Apart from the family's own trauma, the family themselves did not have the resources or the professional support to give Kumanjayi everything he needed.
That is absolutely correct.
Despite that, they did do many things to try and help him, though.
They did.
To give a few examples, one, of course, is the Mount Theo program where you met him.
Yes.
And the Brown family supported him in being there for 4 weeks.
Yes.
And, of course, you'd know they were very involved in the Mount Theo program.
Yes.
And Peggy Brown has an Order of Australia for being
Yes.
one of the founders, along with Yakajiri and others. Another example is, of course, the SevGen program where Leanne joined Kumanjayi
Yes.
for 6 months and a few weeks again later.
Yes.
And are you aware that Miss Oldfield still has a relationship
Absolutely.
with Miss Waller today?
Yes.
Another example is the assessment for fetal alcohol syndrome. You tried many times to get him assessed for that.
Yes.
And Leanne was always very supportive
Yes.
of that. Did Miss Oldfield also contact you for help managing his behaviour generally?
It wasn't for managing his behaviour. It was for when he was, there was a warrant for his arrest.
So normally when he would break out from
Yeah.
his detention or kapu, for
Yeah.
example. And there was, of course, the occasion in March 2017 when he was bitten by the dog when she
Yes.
called you. And there was another escape in July 2018 where she called you
Yes.
and you wrote a letter to the court on that occasion.
Yes.
And then, of course, we've heard about November 2019 when she called you again. And was it always very distressing to Miss Oldfield?
Very.
And was she usually supportive of getting Kumanjayi back to where he'd come from?
Absolutely.
Miss Oldfield was also quite involved in going to court and supporting different solutions that were offered to the court. Sorry, you just need to respond verbally to the transcript.
Yes.
And she also supported the suggestion. In fact, she might have made the suggestion that he spend some time in Papunya to connect with his biological family. And she agreed at times for Kumanjayi to be paroled to her house in Walpuri camp.
Yes.
And of course attended court in person to support him.
She did.
Have you had any contact with Miss Oldfield recently?
Yes.
And how do you think she feels about the loss of Kumanjayi now? Goes without saying, she feels that loss very deeply.
She feels that loss very deeply.
And that she and the family loved him very much.
She certainly did, and they did.
And with the limited resources and the support that they had throughout Kumanjayi's life, they certainly did the best they could to help him. You mentioned in one of your statements that if the report that was ordered by Community Corrections in May 2017 had been passed on, it should have made Kumanjayi eligible to be on the NDIS.
I would imagine so.
Are you able to tell us what sort of supports Kumanjayi may have been entitled to if he'd been successful in getting on the NDIS?
He would have been entitled to a disability pension, so that would have provided some level of financial security, so that food security. He would have been maybe entitled to like occupational therapy, which would you could work with that brainstem development through occupational therapy. He would have been, entitled to my services, I would imagine.
I want to ask you about a different topic now, how Kumanjayi coped in the custody environment. You've told us a little bit about what his behaviour was like when he was in a supportive, stable environment. And I won't get you to repeat all of that, but generally, I guess you've told us that his personality was calm and shy when he was around you and family. Is that right?
Or funny.
Funny.
Playful, childlike. Yeah.
Used to like to play with the younger kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, and listen to music.
Yeah.
You've told us today and in one of your statements, I think you used the words that it was exceptionally difficult to engage with Kumanjayi in the custody environment. Is it generally the case that he didn't cope well in that environment?
I think that comment related more to issues with the environmental setting. You're in the youth detention centre, there was just this horrible little room that they would put me in with him, and then in the adult detention centre they would just put me in the visitors room with him, so there may be other people sitting over there.
And so outside of your visits with him at the correctional centres or the youth detention centres, did you have any knowledge of how he coped generally in the correctional centres?
I don't think he coped well in the correctional centres.
And is that going back to the point of it not being a supportive, stable environment?
Yes.
Perhaps too much chaos in the correctional environment?
Yes.
Obviously, we know he broke out a number of times. On that occasion in 2017 when he was bitten by the dog, Leanne called you very distraught about that, didn't she?
Yes, she did. Otherwise I wouldn't have known about it.
Yeah. Do you know how Kumanjayi coped with that instance of being bitten by a dog?
Well, I went to the hospital to visit him, but he was actually in surgery when I went up to visit him, so I didn't see him at the time. And then the next time I saw him, I asked him about it, but it's like as if it didn't happen. It's like as if, oh yeah, okay. That's that dissociated from it.
Are you aware of whether that would have had any lasting impacts on him?
I would imagine so. Even if it's not consciously recognised, it would be in his body.
You describe in your statement, I think what you describe as the third time he broke out, you said that Miss Oldfield called you and she was terrified of what the police might do to him.
Yes.
And you said that Kumanjayi was too distressed and he would not listen to you.
Yes.
Do you recall why he was distressed on that occasion?
I think he was afraid of being arrested, and he was so distressed. And I should have rephrased that word from, it's not that he wouldn't listen to me, he was listening to me to the best of his capacity. He just didn't have the capacity to listen properly because he was so distressed.
And do you know why he was so afraid of being arrested?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
He was afraid for the same reason that Leanne was afraid. He was afraid of being hurt.
And I believe that's the same occasion where you wrote the letter to the court saying that he'd been mistreated or badly treated while in custody.
Yes.
As a person who had no ability to self-regulate, as you've described, if he feared the police or going back into custody, it's right then that he was only able to respond irrationally using his survival instincts, as you've described.
Yes, but I do want to acknowledge him. He was standing there at the fence and I was standing a little distance away so that he could sense my presence and I could communicate with him, and I could see him trying so hard to bring his own regulation down. I saw him trying, yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the arrests or attempted arrests by the police on the 6th and 9th of November 2019. Have you had the opportunity to review the report from Dr. Laura Scott?
No.
I might just read out a couple of sentences of what she said. Dr. Scott has said this about her conversation with you.
Yep.
She said, when asked why she, being you, believed that Mr. Walker sometimes coped with arrest and sometimes resisted strongly, she felt this depended on whether the arrest was carried out in a trauma-informed manner. Ms. Chilvers asserted that Leanne had always encouraged Mr. Walker to turn himself into police. She would gather family around once he calmed down and they would take him in. In this context, she felt the arrest was able to occur more safely. And Your Honour, that's at item 10-13B on page 7. You recall saying that to
Yes.
Dr. Scott? I want to ask you about the 6th of November arrest first. I'm assuming you've seen the video footage of that from what you've said.
I've seen aspects of it.
From what you've seen, is that an example of Kumanjayi using the flight response?
Yes.
You made a comment earlier today that the police, when asked by counsel assisting, that the police should have done the opposite of what they did. Was that in reference to this incident?
Yes.
Given Kumanjayi's cognitive impairment, are you able to identify any problems with the way that the police engaged with Kumanjayi on that occasion?
It's I just want to say the whole thing was done wrong. That's all I can say. It's like done wrong in every single way. They barging in, no consultation with the family. It just wasn't the right way to do it at all, from either a cultural perspective or from a trauma-informed perspective.
In particular, apart from the things you've just mentioned, is there any issue you see with the police making physical contact with Ms. Robertson?
Yes.
And what's that?
With Kumanjayi Walker.
Oh, making the contact with Rakisha Robertson by touching her on the arm to remove her from the doorway.
Oh, sorry, I was not thinking of the same incident that you're referring to. You were talking about the axe incident. Yeah.
Yes. Which incident are you talking about?
I
The
was
9th of
talking.
November.
Yeah.
Would you prefer to watch that footage?
I don't want to watch it. I know I have seen it, and I don't think it's appropriate for them to manhandle Rakisha.
Do you see any problem with that from the perspective of how Kumanjayi would have reacted?
I guess so. I guess you could say, well, that's his partner and they're using force on his partner. He would have felt defensive.
What about blocking the doorway when
That is
Kumanjayi's-
not a good thing to do.
And why is that?
Like for the example that I gave earlier with that young person in the detention centre, you are caging a person whose primary survival response is flight. So when we're working with young people like that in a therapy room, we make sure we're positioned them near the doorway so they can access the door if they need to leave. We don't block the doorway. Blocking the doorway is a threat.
What about the fact that there were family members like Lottie Robertson present who weren't engaged in the process?
That's not helpful.
And Kumanjayi, in fact, said to the police officers that he wanted to speak to Lottie Robertson.
Yeah.
And the response was something to the effect of, after we handcuff you. Do you see any problem with that?
I think by that stage, he just wanted to run.
It was too late at
It
that
was too
point
late.
to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the 9th of November arrest. So this is obviously the one with Constable Rolfe. Counsel Assisting has already asked you quite a bit about this, but there are a couple of other parts of the arrest that I'd like your comment on. Do you see any issues with the police directing Kumanjayi to stand against the wall and standing in close proximity to him?
Yes.
Is that for the same reasons you've
Yes.
already identified? What about the fact that they made physical contact with him?
That's not okay. That's not appropriate. That was an aggressive act, the way that was done.
What about the fact that his mother, Miss Oldfield, was just outside the house, but she was not spoken to or she was not involved in the arrest?
Inappropriate.
The fact that we can see in that video, Kumanjayi's told not to put his hat back on, and then he immediately puts his hat back on. Is that one of the indications to you that he was not comprehending the words that the police were telling him?
Yes.
You've spoken a little bit about Derek Williams and how he should have been involved in the arrest from your perspective. Have you heard any of the evidence that Mr. Williams gave about his approach to arresting people and to arresting Kumanjayi in the past?
I heard a brief little bit of him speaking, and that's all.
A couple of the things, I'll just outline a couple of the
Thank
things
you.
that he said, and I'll ask for your comment on them. Some of the things that Akpo Williams said he would do is he'd often speak to elders or the family first. He would explain to both the person being arrested and the family what they're being arrested for. He would often use the families to encourage that person either to hand themselves in or to help facilitate the arrest. And he said he'd often tell Kumanjayi to jump in the front of the car rather than in the back seat because that would make him anxious. And he said sometimes it would take him up to 40 minutes to have this conversation with someone he was arresting, like Kumanjayi, and explain the process. Is that a type of approach that you would think is effective in dealing with someone with cognitive impairments?
I've got goosebumps. That is trauma-informed practice at its best.
And presumably you'd agree that's better than the approach taken by the police.
Correct.
On the 6th and the 9th of November. Is that approach of Akpo Williams similar in some ways to what you did at Mount Theo in encouraging Kumanjayi to get out of the truck?
Yes. He's giving him his space and doing it calmly.
Taking the time as long as he needs, gently encouraging him.
Yes.
Reassuring him that he's safe.
Yes.
How important do you think communication is in that process of arrest?
Vital. It's like when you go to the doctors and they're doing a procedure, if the nurse or whatever explains what they're about to do before they do it, it alleviates your anxiety because you know what's happening.
I want to ask you about a different topic, the phone call on the 1st of November, which was after Kumanjayi absconded from Kapu.
Yes.
Ms. Pincus has asked you a little bit about this phone call already. Did you call Kapu from your phone?
Yes.
And That call was not on loudspeaker.
No.
And the person you spoke to, was that Adrian Atkinson?
Yes.
Have you read or heard about what Mr. Atkinson had to say about that phone call?
No.
I'll just summarise it for you briefly,
Sure.
and if you need to see his statement, I'm happy to show it to you. Your Honour, this is statement 8-0A, and it's at paragraphs 12 and 13 on page 5. What Mr. Atkinson says in summary is that Kumanjayi said to him on this phone call, "Sorry that I took off, can I please come back?" Mr. Atkinson said he'd have to speak to his supervisor to check. He put the phone call on hold, spoke to his supervisor, came back on the call and then said, "Sorry, we can't take you back." He also said that the phone was handed to a female who pleaded with him to take Kumanjayi back, and he repeated that Kumanjayi wasn't allowed to come back. And then Mr. Atkinson then notified Kumanjayi's parole officer.
I'm not aware of that phone call.
Miss Oldfield says about this phone call, she doesn't remember whether Kapu said they could take him back or not. She does remember that you handed the phone to her, and the person on the phone told Miss Oldfield that she had to take Kumanjayi to his parole officer.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Do you recall that as being part of the phone call you've described?
I do now.
Is it right that at no point on the phone call, Kapu said they would take Kumanjayi back?
At no point on the phone conversation I had, Kapu said they would or wouldn't take.
Do you recall handing the phone to Miss Oldfield at some point?
I can't recall if I did hand it to, I didn't think I actually did hand it to her, because my recollection of that phone call was that they said they would have to have a meeting. So maybe I passed it to her to give him her phone number, but I don't recall that. And Kumanjayi was not on that phone call at any time.
Is it possible that Miss Oldfield you did hand the phone to her and she did speak to them briefly?
It is possible, yes.
Is it possible that they told her on that conversation that she should take Kumanjayi to see his parole officer?
Yes.
And is it possible that perhaps even if it was not your understanding of the conversation, that Miss Oldfield and Kumanjayi were left with the impression that Kapu would not take him back?
It is possible.
Did Kumanjayi say anything to you at that time about how he felt about going back to Kapu?
He didn't say anything.
Did he say anything to you about how he felt about the possibility of going back to prison?
He didn't say anything at all.
Do you have any idea other than from speaking to him about how he might have felt about going back to prison at that time?
Well, I can tell you that he wouldn't have been there and stayed there if he wasn't in agreement with the plan to go back to Kapu at that stage. So I don't think going back to prison was in his mind. I think he was about, I need to go back to Kapu was in his mind, because that was the purpose of the meeting.
Would it surprise you to hear that after this phone call, when Miss Oldfield took Kumanjayi to go see his parole officer, that he ran away?
That wouldn't surprise me.
Would that be consistent with the flight response
It would
you
be.
described?
Yes.
Particularly if he thought that Kapu weren't going to take him back?
Yes.
I want to ask you finally about the events on the 9th of November after the shooting, the conversations you had with Miss Oldfield and Miss Waller. Miss Waller rang you first and told you that Miss Oldfield had rung her. Is that right?
Leanne actually texted me. Not Leanne, sorry. Terry Waller texted me and asked me to ring Leanne because Leanne wanted me to ring her.
And then when you spoke to Miss Oldfield, did she ask for your help with
She did.
finding out what was going on
Yes.
at the police station? Did she say anything else that you can remember?
I can't recall. That was the main... I mean, I was in a state of shock at the time too. Yeah. the main focus, she wanted me to find out what was going on, and I said to her, you should go to the, they should let you in. You should be out, you're his mother, you should be able to be with him.
Do you recall what information she had about Kumanjayi's well-being at that
She
stage?
had no information.
Do you recall how she seemed to you emotionally?
She was distraught. And I told her I would go to, we'll wait, we'll see what happens, and I'll allow that time for them to bring him into Alice Springs, which is why I went to the hospital so early in the morning, because I allowed for 3 hours to travel into Alice Springs, and then I went in. And so after I went in, I rang Leanne and told her that he's not there.
And so that was at about 1 to 1:30 a.m. when you went
Yes.
to the hospital. Why did you think he was being taken to the hospital?
Because the ambulance was there. Well, in my heart of hearts, I felt he had already died. But I was in hope that he would have gone to the hospital. So, the ambulance was there, the Royal Flying Doctors plane came, so, we had to hold on to hope that he may still be alive.
And when you say the ambulance and the Royal Flying Doctors plane was there, are you talking about in Alice Springs or in Yuendumu?
In Yuendumu.
So had somebody communicated that to you, or had you seen it on Facebook?
I was watching Samara's live Facebook feed.
And after the hospital, you went straight to the police station?
Yes.
How long did you wait for the police there?
It was cold and I was freezing, so it was it would have been about 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 minutes.
And did you explain to the police who you were
Yes.
and what your relationship was with Kumanjayi?
Yes, I thought I would use my white status and credentials to be able to get some information.
And did they give you any reason as to why they couldn't give you information?
They just said that they cannot give me any information.
Are you aware now that around 9:30 p.m. that night, the sergeant in charge of the Yuendumu police, with others, had created a ruse involving the ambulance travelling to the airstrip so the Yuendumu community would think that Kumanjayi was still alive and getting medical treatment?
I'm now aware of that. I wasn't aware of that at the time.
Are you also now aware that the police forward commander in Yuendumu spoke to Eddie Robertson just after midnight and lied to him and told him that Kumanjayi was still alive?
I'm not aware of that.
How does it make you feel now that at 1:30, 2 a.m, about 5 or more hours after Kumanjayi had already passed away, you were driving around to the hospital and the police station, waiting around, trying to find out how he was doing?
Upset.
Thank you, Ms. Chilvers. Those are my questions.
Are there any other questions?
Good afternoon. My name
Good
is
afternoon.
Matthew Derrick. I'm from Narja.
Hello.
Let me know, would you like to take a moment?
I'll just wipe my tears. That'll be all right.
Your evidence shows the medical difficulties that Kumanjayi had, but you were also able to talk about his insights.
Mm-hmm.
He had insights into his auditory learning. He had insights into the way violence affects people.
Mm-hmm.
And he could articulate those things. Not to take away any of his difficulties, but could you let the coroner know some of Kumanjayi's other strengths?
He loved animals, and you can see by how healthy Red Dog is that he cared for animals. He used to hang around the little kids because of his level of emotional maturity, but they really looked up to him. So in some ways he had some leadership qualities. He loved music. He was very stylish in how he dressed, really. He was quirky and he was funny. He had a good sense of humour. And he had a gift he had a good eye for that, like setting out the art gallery. So that's some of the other strengths. Thank you for asking.
That's quite a lot. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about cultural programs and community control programs. So you've worked at both Aboriginal controlled organisations such as WIDAC, then you've also worked at mainstream services.
Yeah.
And in both of those roles, would it be true to say that you've at least helped Aboriginal people in both of those services?
Yes.
What do you see as the benefits in service delivery for Aboriginal people when you're working through an Aboriginal controlled organisation?
Bottom up, like cultural programs, empowerment, lots of benefits.
Okay. Do you think some of the benefits could include that it's more likely that there might be a culturally appropriate and safe service provider?
Yes.
And perhaps the management might have a better understanding of their own clientele?
They should, yes.
And do you think generally there might be, these kinds of things might create a greater level of trust for their clientele?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you noted that Kumanjayi Walker thrived the first time he went to SevGen.
Yes.
And I believe part of that you mentioned how culturally supportive they were.
Yes.
Can you expand on what made SevGen so culturally appropriate?
I think because they're Aboriginal people that have big hearts and really respect the importance and understand and respect the importance of culture as healing. So they made a big, and you know, a lot of the communities on the East Coast, the kids are disconnected from their culture. So to have somebody come with cultural knowledge and be able to share that knowledge was beneficial two ways for those other young kids, but it also gives that pride. It was more about giving Kumanjayi pride in himself as a Warlpiri young person.
Okay. You mentioned that, and that's an interesting point. That's obviously one thing that was very specifically valued by Kumanjayi, as it seems. What other things, why else do you think it was specifically important for someone like Kumanjayi Walker, particularly for Kumanjayi Walker?
Because it's relationship-based as well. And, you know, healing comes through relationship.
And would those kind of benefits be important for Aboriginal people more generally who might need these kinds of services?
Yes, for all people who need these kind of services.
Thank you. Okay. Now, you noted that Leanne Oldfield stayed with Kumanjayi for 6 months
Yes.
at SevGen, and that's over in Queensland.
Yes.
Isn't it? That's quite a big trip.
Yes.
It's uprooting a life for 6 months.
Yes.
So that's quite a significant
Commitment. Yes.
Now, I know that SevGen required a carer to come or a family member to come, but what value do you think it was for Kumanjayi having Leanne there with him?
She was his secure attachment, so she was the most important person in his life. So that gave him that level of security to have her with him. So that would have helped to stabilise, you know, there's a safety in that connection.
Okay. And so would it be fair to say that it might be important for Aboriginal people in general to be close to their peers and family when they receive these kinds of services?
Vital.
And is this because of, in the least, the fact that they've got that language support with them?
That's an important part of it.
and also the cultural support.
Yeah, but the family, family is really important, and they too need the healing and support.
And would that lend credence to the idea that it would be fantastic if these kinds of services could be carried out on country?
Yes.
For those same reasons?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think if Kumanjayi had the right kind of rehab services or support services available in Yundamu, that would have increased the chances of him being able to receive receive the benefits of the kinds of services that he might have required?
Yes.
Now, you note in your evidence that there's a breakdown in services in the transition for a young person going into adulthood, particularly if they're in prison or something like that, because some services stop when someone's 18.
Yes.
Could you let the court know what kinds of difficulties, practical difficulties, this can cause?
Well, if you've had a young person who's been in juvenile detention, I'm thinking of a specific example, not Kumanjayi, from the age of 14 to the age of 18, and then on his 18th birthday he's transferred over to the adult detention centre, that is a shock. That is that is a shock. That is...
And so that's...
Is it a humane way to treat a young person?
No.
If there is a requirement that children move from youth detention into the adult custodial environment, is there a way that could be done that is more humane than simply uprooting overnight sometimes?
Well, I had one young fella, he only had like a couple of weeks to go on his sentence past his 18th birthday, and I pleaded for them to not send him to adult detention for that time, let him finish those last couple of weeks in juvenile, and that request was denied.
And if they are going to transfer a young person, is there a better way of doing it?
Yes, I think if they are going to transfer a young person from the juvenile centre to the adult centre, then most of our young people have family members in the adult centre, and it may have been, it requires a little bit of work, but to have a family member brought over to the juvenile centre to sit with them and explain it and transition them over there, that would be one way to make it less terrifying for a young person. That's just what I'm thinking off the top of my head.
Is removing a young person from youth detention and then simply placing them into adult detention without any preparation for that move trauma-informed?
No.
Is it the opposite of trauma-informed?
It is.
Thank you. I might ask you now a little bit about Kumanjayi's experience in youth detention and how it might have affected him moving forward in his life. Now, there's records before the coroner that show that Kumanjayi Walker was transferred between Alice Springs Youth Detention Centre and Dondale on a number of occasions. Once was in around April 2017. What I wanted to ask you about was on around 28 August 2018, and at that stage he was engaged in your services with you around trauma counselling. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And it seems that on the 7th of September 2018, you raised an objection. After the event, you noted your objection to the transfer by email for not being consulted on that.
Yes.
Now, were you aware that by that time, the Royal Commission into Child Protection and Youth Detention in the Northern Territory had made this following recommendation. I'll read it out to you. A child or young person is to be placed in detention facility nearest to the place of their residence or his or her family or carer, and that consultation prior to transfer occurs, and this consultation take place in a fair and transparent manner, with the primary factor being the well-being and interests of that young person. Now, is it fair to say that given you were providing him with medical services, you might have had an opinion on that transfer and the effect it might have had on his medical and social well-being?
Can we remove the word medical out of there? So therapeutic services, absolutely. Why would you, a young person is being provided with a therapeutic service and a support, somebody that's trusted to.
What would have been the benefits for Kumanjayi Walker if he remained as close as possible to his usual residence? What's the value of being that close?
Family can visit.
Okay. And when he did get transferred, how did that affect the way that you were able to provide services?
I could no longer provide services.
And did that have an effect on the progress that you were making? I know that sounds like a dumb question.
Of course.
Now, as I understand it, at the time you were also working with him in the context of domestic violence services, is that right?
Maybe, I'm not sure. If that was before January 2018, yes.
No, it wasn't, so...
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now, I know you've had a couple of questions already about the kinds of events that have occurred for Kumanjayi Walker in detention.
Just before we go to that, sorry to go back. We were talking about 18-year-olds being moved from youth detention to adult detention. We've also talked about, or heard a little bit about, the impact of moving a young person from one detention centre to another, in this circumstance, further away from family. Just on the trauma-informed side of things, we talked about the impact that has on the child who is moved.
Yes.
What impact does it have on all the other children when something like that occurs?
I'm not sure I can answer that because I don't know the answer to that.
Do you think it could be a traumatic situation to have one of their cohort?
I guess it depends on the relationships between them.
Right.
If they were a support for each other, then yes, it would be. But the kids in youth detention, they're all, I would say 100% of the kids in youth detention are kids with developmental trauma of some sort. And I say that from my experience working there. They're mostly they're in survival mode being in there anyway. So they're so used to things coming and going, and people coming and going as well. So I would say that would probably impact more when a young person has a connection with another young person, and that's a support or a family member, and then they take one and they don't take the other. But apart from that, I can't really answer that question because I have never asked a young person that question.
I'm just thinking it might add to that sense of chaos and uncertainty.
It does.
That at any stage you can be moved.
Yes.
And taken away.
That does. Yes, I've worked with young people that they're talking about sending them to Darwin, and then they don't send them. So they get used to the idea that they're going to be sent to Dondar, and then they're not sent, and so they're destabilised again, and then all of a sudden they get sent. That's not trauma informed.
Thank you. I'm about to ask you about some specific incidents. some of these that are on the coroner's records or the brief of evidence. Some of these might be disturbing, so I might just give a bit of a warning for any anyone that's present, as well as anyone watching, and I might just give a couple of seconds to start answering my questions. I possibly won't even go into the explicit details on some of these points, but there are at least one incident of Kumanjayi Walker or a number of incidents of Kumanjayi Walker threatening self-harm. Clearly, based on that, and I can go into more detail, but I don't think it's necessary. So of those 3 incidents, clearly that kind of conduct or behaviour suggests that youth detention was a place of trauma for someone like Kumanjayi.
Yes.
And then, just to add the record, there were also 2 incidents where he physically manifested that self-harm. Okay, now...
And I was not aware of that.
There was an incident where he was, after self-harming, he was placed at risk. And the record itself doesn't provide this, but you might be aware from your time working in youth detention that means that he would be put in a solitary cell for observation.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the kind of effect would have been on Kumanjayi in his circumstances?
That would have been overwhelmingly negative. You know, I worked with other young kids I wasn't working in the detention when Kumanjayi was there. When I was working, some of those kids have got cuts all the way up their arms from self-harm in detention.
And for Kumanjayi, being alone in a cell, even if it's for the purposes of observation...
Terrible, frightening, scary, scared to death.
Could it potentially exacerbate the problem?
Yes.
There is also a record that on the 28th of July 2018...
Can I stop you? So the at-risk response, you say, is not trauma-informed.
Yes.
What would it look like to have a trauma-informed at-risk response in a youth detention centre?
To have someone come and sit with them, someone trauma-informed in their practice, somebody that they trust and feel okay to be with, to come and sit with them. I know that requires a lot of resources, I understand that, but so does a young person harming themselves require a lot of resources. So, yeah, they just need to have someone come and sit with them.
You talked about soft rooms.
Yeah.
My understanding is an at-risk room would not present as a soft room.
No.
If a child needed to be moved to a different part of the centre so that they could, for example, be observed.
Mm-hmm.
If they were, if they did have someone sitting with or near them, would it be appropriate from a trauma-informed point of view that the room that they were located in was what you've described as a soft room?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Now, Kumanjayi Walker spent, according to the brief, the evidence, Kumanjayi Walker spent a considerable time in youth detention.
Yes.
Which also coincided with the reporting period of the Royal Commission into Youth Detention in the Northern Territory.
Yes.
And by my calculation, it appears that might have been about 375 days.
1 year and 5 months.
I'm going to talk now. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the findings from the Royal Commission and just ask your opinion of these things happen to Kumanjayi, what kind of effect that might have had. So one of the findings was youth detention centres used during the relevant period were not fit for accommodation, let alone rehabilitating children and young people.
Correct.
The inadequate facilities children put and youth people's the inadequate facilities put children and young people's health and safety and well-being at serious risk.
Correct.
Contrary to the Youth Justice Act at the time, there was a practice of requiring all detainees who received a family visit to be randomly subjected to unclothed searches, which means he would have been strip searched any number of times.
I'm not aware of that. I didn't witness that, so I can't comment.
Sure. The approach to isolation of children and young people in the Northern Territory detention centres was indicative of the system in crisis.
Yes.
The healthcare needs of children and young people in youth detention with alcohol and drug addiction or experiencing mental health issues were not adequately.
Correct.
To your knowledge, did Kumanjayi Walker suffer from any of the effects of these kinds of conditions?
He experienced those, so he would have been impacted by those experiences.
Would you be able to provide an opinion of what kind of effect that might have had?
It would have been the added effect of institutionalisation with that. So that was why it was hard for, he had people like the institutions making all the decisions for him, doesn't help his decision-making processes. And that is traumatising. So it's just that cumulative trauma.
And you've probably answered this question, but this effect, could that have been a long-term effect?
Yes.
And in these conditions that we've just described, spending all those days in youth detention, is it likely that would have actually assisted in ensuring that that kind of conduct and conditions would have actually assisted in ensuring that Kumanjayi Walker wouldn't have offended again?
Those conditions will not help somebody. There's no addressing of their criminogenic needs in that environment.
And my understanding of your evidence is Kumanjayi Walker experienced trauma prior to being in youth detention.
Yes.
What do you think the added effect of this kind of trauma might have had on him? Is there
It is a cumulative effect. It is an additive effect.
Now, do you think this could have affected Kumanjayi Walker's decision-making and choices when confronted by state authority figures such as the police? As in his experience in youth detention and guards might have had an impact on...
Yes.
Now, given all these difficulties, would it be fair to say that this is a reason why all opportunities should be taken to divert young people away from contact with the criminal legal system?
Agreed.
And if ultimately a child does have to go to detention or interacts with the police, shouldn't these institutions be set up in a way that minimises these kinds of traumas?
They should.
Now, this might sound like a dumb question, but just to avoid all doubt, what is the relationship between these kinds of traumas and the likelihood that a person would commit an offence or re-offend?
If criminogenic needs aren't addressed, then they are going to re-offend. So that would increase the likelihood of re-offending if there's no rehabilitation.
And if someone is in youth detention, in a sense, that could be an opportunity to receive medical assessments and things like that, and potentially create treatment plans that you've referred to previously. Is it potentially those treatment plans could identify triggering points for people like Kumanjayi Walker?
Yes.
And ways to avoid those kinds
Yes.
of and ways to de-escalate a situation?
Yes. We used to develop we called them positive behaviour support plans in the youth detention centre. So it would be to get to know those particular young people, what their triggers are and how best to respond to them.
And for example, that child that you mentioned, the 5 guards around the
Yes.
bar, if they had an assessment, they might have identified that might have been the wrong way to do it.
Yes, I mean, that's just basic common sense, really, that one. Yeah, there's no assessment needed.
No. I want to talk very briefly about that situation with Kumanjayi Walker and the dogs.
Yeah.
We've heard evidence in this inquest that the police use dogs in part to hope for compliance from the person that they potentially use the dogs on. Do you think that would have worked for someone like Kumanjayi?
No, he was in flight mode. That's a survival mode.
So it wouldn't have had the desired effect, essentially.
Correct.
And you've previously talked about the amount of high proportion of children who have developmental trauma difficulties and things like that.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that it wouldn't have worked? Well, there's a decent chance it wouldn't work for a number of those kinds of children either.
A number, yeah. It depends on their survival response. If they freeze, it might work. Like if they, in that moment they froze, it might work, but it just depends on the individual's survival pattern.
But we don't really want to adopt techniques that create a traumatic response.
Yes, that is called re-traumatising.
Now, in your evidence, you note the value of police being trauma-informed, which I will ask you about in a moment and ask you to expand on the value of that. But it'd be fair to say that this use of police dogs, things like that, that wouldn't be trauma-informed practice, would it?
It would not be.
And would this suggest that then perhaps maybe some limitation to the extent that police can be truly trauma-informed, in the sense that police might do their job in an entirely good faith manner, but at the end of the day, they, by the nature of their job, they'll still maybe required to use force or imprison people.
Yes.
There is essentially a built-in limitation on how trauma-informed police can be.
I don't think there's a limitation on how trauma-informed that they can be. And, you know, the example is, you know, if someone like Derek can respond in that way and have a successful outcome, yeah, I don't think there's a limit.
Fair enough. But perhaps for Aboriginal people, in terms of their own trauma responses, there is a history of discriminatory practices that may affect any interaction with the police to cause a sense of fear or anxiety.
Yes.
We've spoken a little bit previously
Yes.
this morning about
Yes.
the
And so if you're trauma-informed, you know how to respond to those trauma responses appropriately.
Okay.
I mean, it does make the job difficult. I respect that.
Yeah. I suppose ultimately what I'm getting at is that ideally, is it possible that other professionals, including someone like Derek, so let's say a non-mainstream or an Aboriginal community police officer or social workers or someone else, might be best placed to be the first responders when there's an incidence of someone who's suffering from trauma?
Yes.
Now, in your evidence, you noted that it's your opinion that if the police had been trauma-informed in training on the 9th and 9th of
Yes.
November, then the death could have been avoided.
Yes.
For the benefit of the coroner court, could you expand on why you think this might be the case?
Because if they had have been trauma-informed in their practice, they wouldn't have triggered a traumatic stress reaction in Kumanjayi. So he wouldn't have reacted by using the scissors, and then he wouldn't have been shot. I would hope.
Now, there has been evidence before the coroner that there sometimes are warning information on police systems for individuals who might have cognitive or mental health impairments. But assuming that this can't happen all the time, can police be trained to be able to identify someone who has something
Yes.
wrong? Okay. And what kinds of things should they be looking out for?
The behaviour of the reaction of the nervous system. You could see him using his social engagement system in the first instance. Yeah. You can see in the behaviour.
Now, are you aware that recommendation 25.1.5 of the Royal Commission into Youth Detention says the following, I'll read that out, that all Northern Territory police receiving training in youth justice, which contains components about childhood and adolescent brain development, the impact of cognitive and intellectual disabilities, including FASD, and the effects of trauma, including intergenerational trauma. So essentially the Royal Commission suggested this kind of training.
Right.
Police. Now, I'm not aware of anything on the brief that says one way or another whether or not police have implemented this training, but is it fair to say that at least in this instance, if there was that training there, that it was inadequately implemented?
100%.
Going back slightly to the police computer systems and the warning systems, what kinds of information should be sort of ready, available to the police if they're going to have a full understanding?
Even if it, there was a history of his arrests. He was arrested multiple occasions. So there should have been notes related to how he was likely to respond and how to respond to not create a negative outcome.
All right, thank you. Now, would this assist if the person was at some stage, the individual was at some stage to give consent to something like this? Would it assist if particular diagnoses such as FASD or PTSD be included on there? Things like whether or not someone has an aggravated startle response or poor impulse control. Is that all helpful information?
I guess so, but it's hard to get in. Respect and trauma-informed practice doesn't require that,
Okay.
but it may be helpful.
Fair enough. Last set of questions. Just talking about your recommendation of the need for better collaboration between agencies. Is there I think your evidence is that there should be someone who takes the lead on this. Is there a particular agency or group that might be best fit for that position? Like if there's a number of agencies, is there a particular type of agency that might be best placed to take the lead in these kinds of collaborations?
I don't. I think there needs to be a primary, like in Kumanjayi's case, I think the primary organisation should have been WIDAC. So there needs to be somebody within WIDAC that has that high level of clinical skills, trauma-informed practice, and that case coordination. It's really important to have those really strong case coordination skills. So if it could have been somebody within WIDAC, that would have been wonderful.
Okay. And do you think it's necessary for the child, the young person, to have input into this process?
Yes.
And how would you ensure that? What's the best way to ensure that?
Sitting down with family and a young person.
Okay. My next question was whether or not there'd be some value in family being involved in this.
Yes, very important.
And how about maybe elders or
Yes.
other community members?
Yes.
And what's the best way to ensure their input can be gathered and respected and valued and fed in?
I think if you develop a cultural-based care plan that, part of that is who are the people that need to be involved with this young person, and you have those people present so that everybody gets to contribute, including the young person.
Okay.
Can I just ask, you mentioned that a person, if there was such a person employed by WIDAC, someone with high-level clinical skills and case coordination skills, would be the ideal kind of person and location for the primary contact point for care for someone like Kumanjayi.
Yeah.
What sort of caseload can someone like that manage?
Possibly, I would imagine not very many. I would put the caseload at maybe 5, no more than 8.
You noted one example, or potentially one example, of where collaboration might have been successful in Kumanjayi's case, and that's the first time you went to SebGen.
Yes.
And you mentioned that Carlos, the family, Kalus, if I'm
Yes.
pronouncing that correctly, and yourself worked together to make sure that
Yes.
that was quite successful.
Yes.
So all that good work done from Carlos and those guys.
Yes.
Why was that successful? What can you learn from that particular experience?
Collaboration. It was like magic when organisations collaborate with each other. It feels really good. It's like magic. Magic happens. So it's magic.
Yeah. So potentially in that case it was maybe somewhat organic.
It was organic and it was relationship based. Good relationships between the people in those different services.
Thank you very much for your time. That's all my questions.
Thank you.
I'll have 30 seconds.
Sure.
Ms. Childers, you spoke about an example, and I just want to make sure we understand the example properly. You said there was an 18-year-old person who was in youth detention, and when turning 18, the question was whether that person should be moved over to the adult prison. And you advocated for the young person to stay in youth detention for several weeks until the completion of sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Have I got that right so far?
Yes.
But despite that, the person was moved over to adult
Correct.
prison. So the first question is, apart from sentimentality, which I presume is not your basis for acting in that case, is there a good reason that you asked for the young person to stay in youth detention?
Yes.
And can you just explain what that was?
So that he's not exposed to the trauma of entering the adult detention centre. And he was only going to be there for a couple of weeks. Why would you add that trauma to that young person's experiences?
So it's a trauma-informed advocacy from you to the
Yes.
Youth detention. Well, was it to the youth detention
To the youth
management or to the
detention.
adult prison management?
Youth detention.
And the decision to move the 18-year-old was a youth detention decision?
Yes.
And were you advised or informed of any sound or sensible reason why the young person was moved over to the adult prison?
It was just policy.
Policy.
Yeah.
Policy which in effect was cruelty.
Yes.
That's right. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Dwyer.
Just briefly, in relation to some questions about Mount Theo, I appreciate that you've had an opportunity to work in Mount Theo from 2013 to 2015, and you've given some evidence that Mount Theo alone is not enough. Is it your view, however, that the Mount Theo program is an important one?
I do believe it's a very important one.
And it should continue to run, if at all possible?
I would like to see it continue to run.
And are you aware of some recent efforts to try and have it running again?
Yes.
With the assistance of elders?
Yes.
Of course. One of the difficulties we've heard about is that OCA cards are being required for all elders there. Are you aware of any way in which that can be worked around? If not all elders who might be eligible can get it. If not all elders who would be of assistance are eligible for an OCA card, do you see a value in having them there in some capacity?
I do see a value in having them there, and I think, if you wouldn't there's various reasons why people don't have ochre cards, but it's like if there is somebody always there that does have an ochre card, and that child is under the main supervision of other people, I don't see an issue unless it's a child sex offence or something like. Depending on the reason why the person can't get an ochre card.
Sure, but in terms of clearly a risk assessment needs to be done to
Yes.
make sure there are suitable adults.
Yes.
But then, does there need to be some sort of flexibility?
Yes.
So that risk assessments can still allow for elders to be present on Mount Theo,
Yes.
even if they can't jump through those formal hoops
Yes.
like an ochre card. You talked about the need for community healing.
Yes.
And the need for organisational cohesion.
Yes.
Is there a need, in fact, for healing to take place at an organisational level?
Yes.
After Kumanjayi's passing?
Yes.
And who is best placed to deliver that or to assist with that?
I would probably, at my first recommendation, recommend Ghana Healing and whomever they would recommend.
But so those people would come into community and work with the organisations to teach them how to work their way through difficulties.
Yes.
Similarly, in terms of the ongoing conflict in community, which Her Honour has heard something about,
Yes.
is there a need for culturally informed mediators based
Yes.
in community?
Yes.
Are they present there currently?
I'm not aware. They may be, I don't know.
Okay. If they are going to be culturally informed mediators in community, do they need to live in community? At least for a period of time.
If they were going to be working to resolve the issues, yes, I think so, yes.
Is Ghana Healing that you spoke about an organisation that does that sort of mediation work?
They came and supported the community through the trial period, so they do have some strong connections. I wouldn't like to say that I would like to ask them and get their recommendations.
Is that in terms of the focus, you're aware that Her Honour has a power to make recommendations as part of the inquest. Would you be happy to assist us just in terms of looking at any draft recommendations and adding your expertise?
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further. Sorry. Yes, Your Honour, nothing further.
Ms. Chilvers, thank you very much for bringing your expertise, but also your personal and lived experience with Kumanjayi and sharing that with us. You are on a lifelong learning curve. I think we're a long way behind you on this, but we are very interested in learning and understanding trauma-informed engagement. And I'm sure all the organisations involved in this inquest are on that same learning path.
Wonderful.
And in fact, waiting for your online training program so that we can...
there needs to be more than just me. It's a big need.
But thank you for the contribution that you are continuing to make in this area for the Northern Territory.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That completes our evidence today. I note the time, it's 2:00. We've been sitting for a long time today. As indicated earlier, our next sitting day is the 27th of February 2023. I want to thank everybody here for their commitment, dedication and significant contribution to this process. There are some important people who have been contributing as well who are not here today, and I extend my thanks to them. I'm not going to mention people by name, but I particularly wish to thank the parties, their representatives and their background teams that have been supporting their participation. I want to thank the court officers who have been managing large numbers of council and also some tricky electronic equipment. I want to thank the security officers who have been here every day and assisting with that heavy door along with other things. I want to thank the media representatives who have been very dedicated to the inquest to date and getting very important information out to the wider community through the reporting that they've been participating in or facilitating. I want to thank the investigating police. I want to thank the community and the Paramparoo Committee for the very significant engagement that they facilitated for the inquest and for all of the parties. That was a magnificent contribution to understanding and engagement of very important people who would otherwise have found it difficult to be so connected to the process, and I really appreciate that. Of course, special thanks to the council assisting team, Peggy, Paddy and Maria, who will continue to be working very hard and solidly in relation to this matter as they have been during the adjournment break, and season's greetings to all of you very warmly from me, and I hope you benefit from some time with family and friends. I forgot to mention Aboriginal Interpreting Service and Valda. And I know that Valda isn't here today, and I apologise for missing that.